Now start to really get into the topic, and the dot point is the origins of the Persian War. So it's essentially the question of how did the wars between Persia and Greece actually start? The two standpoints are either from Persian imperialism or the Ionian revolt. Now, if you remember what imperialism is, it's essentially a big, powerful country or big, powerful, state. It can even be a city, kind of taking control and enforcing its control over a smaller country. So think what England did to Australia, or England did to America, what America's kind of done in more recent times. Just kind of think that idea. Okay, so for the first part of the argument, Persian expansion / imperialism, which you can look at as the long-term issue rather than a short-term trigger to the actual fighting. Okay, so look at the size of the empire controlled by Greece is over here. Okay, so look at all this. This is all kind of over time. And this is only one king of Persia, by the way. The other kings ended up taking more territory as well. Okay, after Cyrus the Great. So it's quite a large empire, and their empire generally is moving westward, which is the direction of Greece. So some might argue that eventually Greece and Persia were going to clash because Persia just kept expanding west. Okay, so after Cyrus, you've got Darius the First, you've got Xerxes as well. And there's a guy in between who we're not really going to do too much work on, Cambyses, but you don't need to worry too much about him. One point to this is the fact that Persia takes the Bosphorus, which I'm going to show you in a second, and the Hellespont, which I'm going to show you in a second, is further proof that a clash between Greece and Persia was extremely likely. Okay, and I'm going to show you a picture of them now before coming back to this slide. This is up here. Okay, so this here is the Bosphorus, which is essentially, it's kind of connecting your Asia to Europe. Okay, and the Hellespont is our narrow stretch of water down here. Persia controlling that kind of is a bit of showing moving towards where Greece is. Okay. Don't forget, you got a lot of Greeks that live along here that essentially became controlled by Persians. Okay? So Herodotus in particular likes to place blame on Persia, calling them quite imperialistic. So the country or the empires extending their power and influence through taking over new territory, and making them, loyal to Persia. Persia's according to Herodotus, Persia definitely likes having power. They definitely don't want to give it up. And the other idea is the sons of Persian kings, so who would become a new king, had a habit of trying to outdo their father and saying, well, I know my dad did this, conquered this territory, but I conquered more. Okay, I controlled more territory than my dad did. So it's just an interesting idea towards why the conflict started. But again, quite a Hellenocentric way to look at it. That it was Persia's fault completely. Now, now we get to the Ionian revolt, which is essentially a short-term trigger to why the conflict started. So if Persian imperialism was a long-term cause that was kind of bubbling under the surface, the Ionian revolt essentially made it definite that Persia and Greece were going to clash. Now the context. I told you about Greeks living in Persian territory. They were known as Ionian Greeks, okay, that lived along here, okay? Now, they lived in territories. There was technically a Greek person that controlled the Ionian Greek cities, known as a tyrant. But don't think about tyranny as the same way we use it today. Okay, but essentially these Greek tyrants they're kind of puppet rulers for the Persian Empire. So they're just there to do what they're told. They kind of have power, but essentially if the Persian Empire tells them to do something, they do it. This is a map of what's called the satrapies. Now, the Persian Empire was essentially split into small states and regions, and you'd have like a Persian guy who would kind of be living there, and he would report back to the king, but he would let the Greek cities run themselves. They'd essentially do whatever they want, but if Persia called on them, they had to listen. So many Ionian Greeks, as you can probably guess, they're unhappy with this. They don't like that they've got to pay money to Persia. They don't like that they see themselves as more civilized than the Persians. They see Persians as barbarians and uncivilized compared to them. And Ionian Greeks wanted to rule themselves. They didn't want to be ruled by the Persians. So, essentially, okay, and I'll try and go through this, and I'm not going to read off the screen because you can pause and do that. But you have a guy who's a tyrant of the city, whose name is Hestiaeus. Okay, he's a tyrant of the city of Miletus. Now, the king suspects that Hestiaeus is going to betray him. So he brings him to the city of Susa to kind of ensure that he can't do anything he shouldn't be doing. Hestiaeus leaves his son-in-law, Aristagoras, in control of the city. Aristagoras is very power-hungry. He wants to control the city and more for himself, so he starts to cause a little bit of trouble. Now, we get to 501 BC. In the island of Naxos, there's a bit of trouble there. You've got this power struggle between this small group of oligarchs who are kind of this small group of people who have power, and then you've got these other people like, no, the people should have the power, not you. Aristagoras gets involved. Okay, now he goes to a Persian guy of the satrapy, and he says, look, why don't you provide me with some ships, and we can go in there, and if we take this city of Naxos, it's going to help Persia get more power. Now, the Persian guy agrees to this, but it fails. Aristagoras fails in his chance to grab Naxos and take Naxos. And basically what happens after that, Aristagoras, now really scared of the punishment he's going to get from Persia, now goes, well, I'm in big trouble here, and now he goes to Athens and stuff instead and says, I'm going to help you take power from Persia. So Aristagoras really is trying to play both sides here to gain power, and essentially Athens agrees, and that is kind of leads to our first kind of conflict between Persia and the Greeks. Now, the Athens and Eretria, two cities, they send some Greeks to Ionia, and essentially they sack the city of Sardis, which is a Persian-controlled city. And the big no-no that happened here, one of the temples, a religious temple, is burned to the ground. Now, this is a really big insult to Persia, because even in war or battle, to burn a religious temple is I guess a war courtesy that they shouldn't have broken. And this is supposedly what angers Persia the most. Now, after the Greeks and the Athenians cause this trouble, they retreat. The Persians follow. The Ionian cities who are left there, the Athenians go home. The Ionian cities who thought, oh, the Athenians are here to help us, they're absolutely destroyed by Persia. They're killed, they're sold into slavery, they're really, really hurt as a result of trying to rise up against Persia. And the Athenians leaving high and dry. Aristagoras ends up getting killed. Now, again, the consequences of this. The Persians take 4 years to then control things in Ionia. But Darius, the now king, is obsessed with revenge on Athens. Supposedly, every night before dinner, he made sure one of his servants said, "Sire, remember the Athenians," so he would never forget that he needed to take revenge on Athens. Okay? And then ultimately, we would get the first war between Greece and Persia. Now, there's a lot more going on here, but using the slides and what I've told you here and what we'll cover in class, that's essentially what you need to know between Persian imperialism and the Ionian Revolt.